So welcome everyone to my class today. Oh, say can you see? Introducing early U.S. military records. So my name is Alyssa Martinez. I am one of the research specialists at the Family Search Library, and I'm a member of the United States and Canada team. And I'm currently working on getting my certification with the BCG. And I'm so excited to teach you a little bit more about U.S. military records. It can be a very huge topic and record type, and it can be difficult to know where to begin. And so for this class today, we're going to discuss early United States military conflicts from the Revolution up until the Civil War. So my objectives for this class is we're going to start talking about some of the history and background of military records. Then we'll talk about key record types for this time period. Next, we'll discuss how you can figure out if your ancestors actually served in the military based on other records. Then I'll briefly touch on how you can find these records, and then we'll go through a case study to sum up everything that we learned. So let's begin by discussing some of the history and background of the U.S. military. So just as a refresher, there are 4 historic branches of the military that affects early U.S. military research. Currently, there are 6 branches, but since the 5th branch is the Air Force that began in 1907 and again in 1947, and then the 6th branch is the Space Force, which began in 2019, and since those are more recent, we won't discuss them today. But the 4 branches that affect early U.S. military include the Army, the Navy, and the Marine Corps, all which began around 1775. They actually were first known by different names. The Army was the Continental Army, the Navy was the Continental Navy, and then the Marine Corps was known as the Continental Marines. And then finally, we have the Coast Guard, which began in 1790, and then it was originally known as the Revenue Cutter Service, but then in 1917, it became the Coast Guard. So there's a lot of major U.S. conflicts that your ancestors may have served in. I'm hoping that you're familiar with most of these military engagements, but I wanted to just refresh the key ones that they most likely would have served in. There are many colonial wars, but since that was before the United States became a country, we won't discuss those conflicts for this class. And today we're going to discuss the 4 of the earliest major U.S. conflicts. First up is the American Revolution. This was from 1775 to 1783. It's when the United States separated from Great Britain, and it also involved the Hessian soldiers and France. Next up, we have the War of 1812. This is from 1812 to 1815, and this conflict was between the United States and Great Britain. The Mexican-American War was after Texas was annexed in 1845. The United States and Mexico went to war between 1846 to 1848. And then finally, we have the American Civil War, which was between 1861 to 1865. And it's where half of the country seceded and we went to war. We have the Union up in the north and the Confederacy down in the south. To help you better understand and read these records, let's go through some vocabulary. There are 3 types of soldiers, especially when you're talking about the 19th century soldiers. So they can either be artillery, which are soldiers who are working with field pieces such as cannons. Then we have the cavalry, which were soldiers on horseback. And then we have the infantry, which are soldiers who are on foot. You also need to know the difference between a regular and a volunteer. So regulars are members of the regular armed forces. They are service members of maybe the Army or the Navy, and they are permanently part of the military. The volunteers are militias who are raised up by the state governments during the time of war, and they're just going to be doing it by their own free will, and this is the most common among the 19th century wars. So now let's discuss some terms used for entering and exiting the military. First, you have to enlist, which means you are enrolling in the armed forces. Then a soldier would mustered in, which isn't the same as enlistment. Enlistment is signing up to serve, Mustering in is when they gather together with the company and they report for active duty. Next, the soldier could muster out, which is the end of his military service, and usually this refers to when a regiment reaches the end of its term of service. So, for example, if a regiment was formed to serve up to 3 years, after those 3 years, the regiment would then muster out. And then when someone departs the military, it is called a discharge, which means they left the military earlier than expected. Honorable discharged means they served faithfully. Someone might have left the military early for either health or maybe family reasons. There's also dishonorable discharge, which means someone committed an offense or a felony to the country or the military. And this could result in being disqualified from benefits, or they could have even been put in prison. And then a furlough is an official leave of absence that was given to a soldier. And AWOL means absent without leave. Basically, they did not have permission to leave. If a soldier was AWOL for only a short period of time, the person was punished, but it wasn't usually that severe. But if it was for long periods of time being AWOL, that could result in them being dishonorably discharged. So these are some of the terms you will see in these records that you're using in genealogy. But just note that there's a lot of other terms used for the military, and so I recommend just using Google or the dictionary to try to figure out what those words mean, because it's important to understand the record completely. Now let's discuss some of the key record types that you will encounter with the 4 wars that we have discussed in the previous section. So there are 4 main record types while we are discussing this class. They are draft records, service records, bounty land records, and pension records. There are a lot more, but these are the 4 main we'll talk about today. So let's begin with draft records. You might be familiar with the World War draft cards, but since we're only talking about early U.S. military conflicts, we'll only discuss the drafts that regard the Civil War. So a draft is to identify men who are eligible for service, and it's also known as a conscription. When helping guests at the Family Search Library, I've realized many people assume that if someone registered for the draft, that they automatically served, but that is not the case. Registering for the draft indicates the man is just eligible to serve based on his age, and they may or may not have ended up serving. The first draft in the United States was called the Confederate Conscription Act, which was conducted by the Confederate Army during the Civil War in 1862. And they had a total of 3 drafts. There was the second one in October of 1862, and the last one was February 1864. The ages of those that were drafted were between 17 to 50. Around 750,000 men registered, but only about 400,000 ended up serving. The second draft was due to the Union Enrollment Act, which was about a year after the Confederates had their first draft, and this occurred March of 1863, and they had 3 other drafts following that one. Those that were drafted were between the ages of 20 to 45. Around 776,000 men were registered for the draft, but it's very interesting, only about 47,000 ended up serving from that draft. So what kind of genealogical information are you going to be finding in these Civil War draft records? On these records, you can find the soldier's full name. You'll get their age, or maybe even their birth date. You'll also get their race, as well as maybe even their birthplace. You'll get a marital status, where they were living, and their occupation. You might even get information about their prior military service or even other family members on the record, and a lot more, depending on the record that you have. And obviously, this will depend on whether it's through the Union or the Confederacy, depending on which draft it is and which state it's coming out of. But let's look at an example. This is a draft register, In the header, we learn that it is for the 15th Congressional District, and it's for the counties in Pennsylvania include York, Cumberland, and Perry. And this was dated June of 1863. But let's take a look at this line at the bottom and learn more about this soldier. On it, we see the soldiers from Windsor, York, Pennsylvania. His name is Jacob Smith, and he was of the son of Henry. The ages were listed as of the 1st of July. So as of the 1st of July, 1863, Jacob was 31 years old. He was a white laborer and married. He was born in Pennsylvania, and he had no former military service. The one thing I love about this record is under the remarks, it lists that Jacob had 4 brothers that were also serving in the army. So what a great clue that Jacob, who was born in 1832 in Pennsylvania, had a father named Henry, and he had at least 4 brothers, of whom also served in the military. So let's move on to the next record, which is service records. During the 19th century, the service records were called compiled military service records, also known as CMSRs. And I'll probably use that a lot more through this class just to make it simpler to say, the CMSRs. We'll talk more about these in a moment, but just know they were created for the volunteers in the military. But those who were regulars for the 19th century, they don't have the CMSRs, they used registers. And then we also have Navy muster rolls. But since most who served during the 19th century were volunteers, you will most likely have to use a compiled military service record, or those CMSRs. And they're also one of the most available records of service records you will find during this time period. So again, just to reiterate, these are for volunteer soldiers only. They actually were also not created at the time of the conflicts, but they were compiled in the 1890s. They started with the Civil War when soldiers had began to apply for pensions. Since they had to go back through all of those records to verify the service, that took a lot of time. So they decided to start a project where they went through the records and gathered them together in a single envelope for each soldier. And they went through all the records, including muster rolls, payrolls, regiment books, description books. Basically, anytime a soldier was named, they would write his name and his company on a regiment on a card, and the cards assumed to be the same soldier were all filed together. So this could mean, because of error, one CMSR could represent 2 people, or one person might have 2 CMSRs, depending on if the name ever got misspelled or if it ever was misfiled. And even though the CMSRs began with the Civil War, the project did end up growing. All volunteers who served between the Revolutionary War to the Philippine insurrection should have a CMSR. Service records will contain a lot of different information, depending on what was captured during that conflict. Often, earlier conflicts have fewer records and less information. But you might get the soldier's name, his age, a physical description, the date he enlisted, where he was living at the time of the enlistment, when he was mustered in and out, the unit, if there was any illnesses or injuries that took part because of his service. You also will know if they were furloughed or if they were ever court-martialed, and it will also include any military engagements they were involved in. Obviously, there might be more, but in general, this is what the CMSRs typically include. So I want to show you some examples for these records, one for an earlier war and one for a later one. So this is a service record, a CMSR for the War of 1812. This first image is the envelope. When you zoom in to the top section, it gives you some basic facts about the soldier. It has his name is Obadiah Kirtland. It tells us which company he is serving in, which is the 13th Regiment, or Nixon's Mississippi Militia. It also says that he is a private and then later an ensign. And then finally, we have some of his card numbers, and which are basically all of the documents that are included in his CMSR. So the next two documents in Obadiah's files are his muster rolls. And remember, this is when the muster rolls means that they are gathering together as a union. In the top section of the muster, on the first one, we have his name, and it says that he is a private. And then on the second one, it now says that Obadiah is an ensign. So he got promoted from a private to an ensign. But if I was doing research, I would want to analyze and evaluate both of them. But because of time, let's just evaluate one of his muster rolls. In the middle section, here we learn that Obadiah served from the 3rd of January to the 24th of April in 1850. This roll was dated the 14th of January, but he commenced his service on the 3rd of January. He was engaged in serving for 3 months, and he was given one horse, which makes sense since his company was of the mounted riflemen. And then he was actually absent at the mustering in, but because of under the remarks, it tells us he was absent because he was on command. So it wasn't that he was AWOL, it just meant he was on command and he couldn't make it to that muster in, but they knew where he was. There are 4 other documents found within Obadiah's CMSR, and all of these refer to his payroll. And it's interesting just to see how much they get paid. And so you just want to make note of all of the different things. It says he was paid $83.45 for his 3 months of service, and then it also shows he got $132. So this is pretty basic of a CMSR, but I want to show you one from the Civil War to show you more information you can get. So again, here is the envelope. This one is for Michael Dunn, and it says that he is a private in Company C in the 4th Massachusetts Heavy Artillery. And again, it has all of the card numbers of the records in his CMSR, and you can see he has a lot more cards than in the previous one we looked at. So again, Michael had many muster rolls, but I just want to show you one example. And it pretty much is the same as Obadiah, but in it, we can also find his birthplace, which is Framingham, Massachusetts. Gives us his age and his occupation as a machinist. And not only do we get the date that he enlisted, but where it was. We also get his physical description, and that he had hazel eyes, brown hair, light complexion, and he was 5'9.5" It also states his mustering in date and where it was, and that there was a bounty paid and due. The next muster roll we have again is of Michael, and this is pretty similar again to the War of 1812, but this one is interesting because it says that he is absent. And the reason for his absence is because he was arrested at Fort Berry, Virginia since March 19th, 1865. And it also says who was the one who ordered his arrest. The next paper I found was interesting because it includes his volunteer enlistment. On it, we learn about his birthplace and his age and his occupation. It also says that he volunteered and he agreed to serve up to 1 year. He agreed to be true and faithful to his allegiance to the United States, but because Michael ended up being absent and he deserted and then later arrested because of his desertion, he was essentially breaking this oath that he made. And so that's likely why in the CMSR they included this volunteer enlistment to show he did sign to agree to serve and he wasn't faithful to that service, to that agreement. And then this final document is a letter explaining more about how he was absent without leave and he had not returned. And it includes a lot of great information that you can read about how he was absent and he had not returned. And there are a lot of documents within his CMSR, but I just wanted to pull out a few of the key ones. Okay, next we have bounty land records. Bounty land is land that was offered to those currently serving or was offered to veterans later on. They were a great incentive for military service. It began in 1776 and went until 1848. It's not given to every person who signed up for the military, but it was given to some. In order to qualify for the bounty land, the person either needed to have a certain number of years to have served or maybe have served the entire length of the war. And the amount of land given depended on their rank. Only specific locations were also set aside for bounty land. Once a person applied for the land after their service, they were granted a bounty land warrant, and then they could exchange the warrant to the General Land Office and receive the land. And these warrants were non-transferable. Even though they were not transferable, they could later still sell their portion of the land. They just couldn't sell their warrant. There have been 3 acts of government regarding bounty land, so let's discuss those. Starting in 1850, the first Bounty Land Act was passed, and it began the incentive for those who were veterans, because previously the bounty land was for those currently serving. So land was first given to veterans and widows of veterans who served during the War of 1812 and the Indian Wars. And the acreage actually that you qualified for depended on the length of their service. So if someone had served 1 month, they got 40 acres. 4 months, they got 80 acres. And 9 months, they got 160 acres. The next 2 acts were pretty similar. First, we have the Bounty Land Act of 1852. This expanded the benefits to officers. And before that, it was only enlisted warrants. At this point, they realized that people were just selling them, so they decided to make them assignable, meaning it was legal to sell them. The next act was 1855, and it gives benefits to every veteran or their heirs who had served in the military since the American Revolution. The veterans and heirs could qualify for bounty land, assuming they had served at least 14 days or traveled at least 1,200 miles. Assuming they did this, the person was then entitled to receive a total of 160 acres of land. Let's say a soldier received 40 acres of land under the Act of 1850. Because of the Act of 1855, they could go back and receive an additional 120 acres to total the 160 acres. And one thing I want to note before moving on is that Bounty Land acted as a benefit for these veterans before pensions. So in a way, bounty land and pensions kind of go hand in hand. Bounty land is offered earlier, and then pensions are for veterans later. And even though the last Bounty Land Act was 1855, and it was the last time bounty land was offered in the United States history, the last warrant issued under this act was in 1857, and some were even issued up until the 1900s, which I think is pretty interesting. Bounty land records is broken into 2 groups. First, we have the application files, and then the entry case files. We're going to focus on the applications since they typically have more genealogical value. So in the applications, you're going to get the soldier's name and which regiment they served with. You will get information about their enlistment and also time frame of when they served and where they served. You might get the widow's name, maiden name, and maybe even their marriage date or place for the couple. You can also get the death date and the place of her death place of her husband because she wanted to show that he was deceased. And you might even get current and former residences of the soldier to help establish who they are. And since bounty land was offered to heirs of the Revolutionary War veterans, you can get some of their heirs. Again, this is the value of the bounty land warrant applications. So let's look at an example of one of the applications. This application is for a widow, and she went to the county clerk to declare that she qualified for the bounty land. So on it, we learned that Divine Embry appeared before the court on the 20th of December, 1850. She was 64 years of age and was a resident of Campbell County, Georgia. She said she was a widow of Merrill Embry, who is deceased, and he was a private in the company commanded by Captain Martin Boone in the Regiment of Georgia in the War of 1812. I love this information at the bottom, though. It tells us that she was married to him on the 6th of December, 1840, and that her maiden name was Howard, and that her husband had died in Campbell County on the 20th of January, 1843, and that she still was a widow. What a great little information from this application. So once the bounty land warrant application was approved, then a warrant is issued, which this is an example of one of those warrants. The documents acted like money or script, so you could see it is a very beautiful document. The person would then take this to the general land office, anywhere where there was available federal land, and they would then exchange it for the acres. And so this document is actually found in the entry case files and not the application file. So if you're interested in finding these, don't look at the application files, look at the entry case file. Okay, next we have pension records. And remember, these are they can kind of be seen similar to the bounty lands since they're both incentives. But pensions is the monetary benefit for veterans, their widows, and their minor heirs. And they would either be paid monthly or annually. There are different types of pensions that we'll talk about in the next slide, but we have invalid, service, and widows. And then things that affected pensions were congressional acts, which would change the benefits and laws around the pensions. They would determine the amount you're going to get, what wars qualified for the pensions, what would happen to for you to qualify, and a lot more. So let's go over the different types of pensions. And remember, the laws and benefits do change a lot throughout time. But first we have invalid. And it's not invalid, it's invalid as in disability. These were offered to those who were injured during the war or they died because of the conflict. The person had to prove that the injury took place during the war, and these would occur for many conflicts since the Revolution. Second are service pensions. They are offered to veterans based on their needs. They would often pass in Congress after many years following a war, because as the veterans aged, their needs would change, and then they were given benefits for their service. And then finally, we have widows and minors pensions. They began to only be offered to widows and minors of soldiers who died during the war, but later it was offered to all widows. Occasionally, there could be a pension specific to family members that are different than widows and minors. For example, during the Civil War, if a younger man died and if their mother was dependent on them, then the mother could qualify for her son's pension. There are a lot of pension acts that are going to give you the foundation of pensions. I'm going to briefly summarize some of them, but I recommend that you if you're looking for a pension, look up the history behind it and some of these acts. So for the Revolutionary War, there are two acts. First is in 1776, which is the pension for those who were injured during the war. And after 1818, it was then based on the needs of the soldier, and it also included veterans and their widows. The War of 1812, the first one was 1871, and it was given to veterans and any widows that they were married to before the war ended. And then in 1878, it was then given to all veterans, widows, and children, regardless if they were married during the war or not. There are also some other pensions for the American Civil War, but due to time, I'm just going to jump to the Civil War pensions. And this is it's important to note, especially when you're preparing for early research. It's good to do a lot of looking at these civil wars because these can give you a lot of great hints for those that were born like in the early 19th century. So for the first Pension Act, it was 1862, and it was for those who were disabled veterans, their widows, and their dependent family members. Next, we have 1890. This act expanded and was based more on service, and it did require that the veteran proved that they were unable to perform manual labor. And then in the Act of 1907 allows for pensions to be based on the age. And as you can see, the more time that goes on, the more and more people that qualify for these pensions. So what are you going to find in pension files? The longer they went on, the more details you got, so they can be very valuable. And first, I want to point one of the things you can find, like on this slide, is you can find a picture. This photograph is actually from a pension file. You also get the name of the soldier and the company and regiment he served in. Also, military wounds that he received while serving. And just note, because he will get more money the worse the wounds are, so he's going to try to talk up some of the wounds that he received, which I think is really fun to read about. You're also going to get current and former residences, which can help track immigration, as well as death and marriage dates and places. And you might even get the maiden name of his spouse. You might also get the names of their children along with their birth dates and any former marriages, because they need to know that they have to prove who the current widow is. And if there was a previous widow or previous spouse, they would need to know how it ended, meaning you can also find divorce papers. When a widow qualified for a pension and then got remarried, she would lose her pension. But if she divorced her second husband, she could reclaim her former pension that was from her first spouse. So that's why you might find divorce papers in a pension file. You might also get a widow's death and also affidavits from neighbors and family members, original signatures, information about migration, and more. So let's look over how pension files records they look like. They are compiled into packets or files, and they can be 20 pages or more. I've seen some into around 200 pages in length. Even the shorter ones can have a lot of valuable information, but obviously the more papers there are, the more valuable they can be. And if you have a chance to order these files, I recommend you take advantage of it. And note, however, that all of the records related to one veteran tended to be combined into a single packet. So all of those that he filed for, let's say if he filed for an invalid and then his widow also filed for a pension, then all of those pensions would be in the same packet under the widow's certificate number. So if you know he was filed for the invalid and his widow filed, they'll be together in the same packet, but under the widow's number. To help you find pensions, there are separate pension indexes for the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and Mexican-American War. And they're combined. There's actually a combined index for Civil War and later wars. And there are two ways that they were organized. First is alphabetical, which includes the widow's name. And the second is organized by the regiment they had served in. So this is an example of an index card. I've seen a lot of people at the library have these and they don't really know what to do with them. But this is a pension index card for Alfred Merritt. And on it, it has his name of his widow, Jeanette, and she also filed for the pension. He served in Company E in the 16th Iowa Infantry. He filed for an invalid pension in 1899, and his widow filed in 1907, meaning Alfred died sometime between 1899 and 1907. And it also includes the application number and the certificate number, and it says that he applied in California. Note that the application number means the person applied for the pension, and the certificate number means the pension was granted. So even if your ancestor didn't receive the pension, they still might have applied for it, and those records you could still find them and they still can be valuable. So some things that you need to remember with pensions. First, not everyone who served applied for a pension, and not all veterans were survived by a widow. So you won't always get a widow's pension. A lot of people assume that you would, but that's not always the case. And then second, not all applicants were granted pension, but even if they weren't granted a pension, the application can still be valuable because rejected pension files are available and they can be very interesting to read because if someone applied and got rejected, they might reapply, adding even more information and more details. So let's look at an example of a pension file from the Mexican-American War. So here we have a page for John Jacob Reiser. And this pension file is actually 45 pages in length. When you get these, make sure you read every single page, but I'm just going to show you 4 of the pages from it. It also includes that he was a private in Company C for the Mormon Battalion, Iowa Volunteers. And in the bottom, it includes his agency, his pay, and when it had commenced. To show you what type of records this file can hold, let me show you a couple. First is a letter from John's son stating that his father was a veteran of the Mexican War, but he died the 15th of April 1910. And John was asking for assistance to receive the balance due to the heirs. And the reason he was is because his son, Charles, was the executor for the probate, for the will. And so he's trying to handle the estate. The next document is his declaration for pensions, and this has great information about John's service. And in the top portion, we see when and where John filed, his age, his residence, and we have enrollment and discharge dates and places, and it says when he served with the Mormon battalions, but also he also served with some other companies as well. And so here's just a summary of all of the great information just from this one record. And then in this bottom portion, it includes some of his physical description, his occupation, and even his birthplace and birth date. I absolutely love this record because to have a man who was born in 1824 in Germany, state exactly in Germany where he's born, that is great information to have. And then it also includes some of his residences in Utah and California. And then the other part of the declaration for his pension includes a law about John's marriage to his wife Helen, where they were married and when. Also, more specifically, of where they resided in Utah and California, which can then help you find other records. Okay, so that was a lot to discuss. We had 4 record types: draft records, service records, bounty land, and pension. But we have a lot of other type of military records. So after you search for what the main 4 ones, I would recommend also determining if maybe there's some other information about your ancestor. So let's discuss how you determine your ancestor's service. So what do you need to know? First, you need to know his name. That might sound weird, but you need to know his full name, his nicknames, initials, and alternate spellings. Don't just think of one name, think of all variations of how that name could have been written out, could have been abbreviated. Just figure out all of the different ways it could have been spelled. You also need to know about what conflict he served in, ideally the company and regiment. Knowing their age while they serve could help you distinguish your ancestor with other men with the same name. Same thing with the residence at the time of service and later in life can help you track where the record might be. And then also knowing family members can also help you distinguish between other men. So let's discuss 3 tips I have when you're determining service. First, you want to use the year of birth to figure out if they were the right age to serve. Then you also want to use clues from other records that were created later in their life because many often reported their military service and talked about it later. And then you also want to search indexes. I would be cautious with these since they are not always originals, but I will talk about why they can help you in a little bit. So this table is in your syllabus in your handout, and it can help you figure out if your ancestor might have served or their likely birth date based on their service. So for example, if we look at the first line for the Revolutionary War, if they were most were between 18 to 30, and so they would have been born sometime between 1745 to 1765. But people could have served as young as 16 and as old as 60, So I included a table for that as well. After determining the birth year and what wars they might have served in, you want to look at clues at other records, starting with family records. This could be in your possession or other descendants. You might have stories that were passed down. You also could get some letters written by family members or photographs, especially those for the Civil War. And then you also might get memorabilia or artifacts that could give you hints of when and where they served. I recommend checking public trees and contact family members and other descendants who are editing those public trees and see if anyone has family records like this. Pay attention to federal census because they can hold valuable clues. In the 1840 census, even though it only asked for the head of household being named, it asked if anyone was a Revolutionary War pensioner, and it listed their name on the second page, and that included widows, so a woman could have been listed on it. In 1890, there was a separate schedule for the Union Civil War veterans. Do note that some did burn up with the rest of the 1890 census, but some survived from some of Kentucky all the way to Wyoming did survive. And then beginning in 1910, they would ask if someone was a Civil War survivor. And in 1930, if the man was a veteran, they would ask which war. And there's even some questions in the 1940 and the 50 supplementary questions. For some people, certain people on each page were asked additional questions at the bottom, and they could ask whether themselves or their spouse or their father were a veteran. You might think, we're talking about early US wars. Why would you want to go all the way to the 40 or 50 census? Well, the last surviving widow of the Civil War died in 2020. So it's not as far from these military conflicts as you think. They still can be really helpful, particularly for the Civil War. Other clues that might have some information about military service include state censuses, county histories, headstone inscriptions, obituaries, or even newspapers. So make sure that you're trying to get as many records about your ancestor as you can to see if there's any clues that state about their military service or other key information to determine the difference between your ancestor and another man that has the same name. And finally, you want to search indexes. There's a lot of indexes, pension indexes and service indexes, but they're going to be organized by military conflicts. So knowing the birth dates can help you know what conflict they might have served in. And the larger conflicts do tend to have more indexes and indexes on multiple sites. There are a lot of various online indexes that you can search by name, and there's also some that are published books. They've been publishing indexes of people who served in the War of 1812 and Revolutionary Wars for years, and many of them are actually found at the Family Search Library. And note that these indexes will simply give you the name of the soldier and the state they served in. And the problem is there can be a lot of people with the same name living in the same area. And since not everyone served in the military, it's easy to assume if the name and state matches, it's your ancestor because not everyone served. But you do need to do a little bit more investigation. This is why you need to be cautious with these indexes. So you might have to order the service record, the bounty land, or the pension records to verify if it is your ancestor. But that's why it's always helpful to determine other records of their military service before you start ordering stuff, because you want to make sure you know everything about your ancestor. So let's talk about some indexes. The first one you can go to is the Daughters of the American Revolution, or the DAR. They have a Patriot Index. This can be helpful to search to see if your ancestor is already in the DAR. First, search for them in this ancestor search. It could tell you about their service, their residence, and their spouse name. And then you can see if how many people have applied for the DAR under that same ancestor. You can also do the descendant search, which again, it gives you the name, the birthplace, and if he was a patriot. But I love the descendant search because it actually shows you the descendancy of the application besides the first 3 generations due to privacy. So it won't do the person who was applying, it won't do their parent, and it won't do their grandparent. But after that, it will show all of the names of up to that patriot. So this can be helpful if you're trying to figure out who's related to who and trying to figure out parentage. You could use this if they are in the database and see what other people think is the parents of your different ancestors. You also can purchase the application and you can also see the sources that were used for the application. So that can also be helpful for you as well. And the SAR, the Sons of the American Revolution, also have a similar descendants database, so I highly recommend that you search here as well. We also have Civil War Soldiers and Sailors Index, and this is brought together by the National Park Service, but they're going to list the soldier's name and the state they came from. But you might need additional information to determine if that is your ancestor. The Family Search Wiki is a great resource as well to learn about military records. There are hundreds of articles about the military, and it's always growing, and more is added each day. You might not have it for every war or every regiment, but if you can find a wiki page about your ancestor's regiment, it can help you learn more about it and maybe where the records are. So let's say if you know your ancestor was living in the 1860 census and you know there's 15 men with the same name as your ancestor in the same state, then you could use this wiki page to figure out where the company was recruited. And then any men who recruited close to your ancestor, then you could determine that might be my ancestor. So you could really shorten the list down to figure out what company your ancestor might live in. So I would go to the state your ancestor's from and search for the Civil War or whatever war you're doing and see if there's a page specific about that regiment. And in addition, there's under the county's wiki page, you're going to get some indexes of information about the different regiments. Now let's talk about how you can find some of these. First, I want to know where are the originals held. First, we have the National Archives, also known as the NARA, and this is located in Washington, D.C., and they have administration that holds CMSRs, pensions, bounty land, and draft records up until 1916. You can also locate them at local state archives, where you can get records like state militias, National Guard units, and even Confederate pensions. Now, the Confederate pensions, they're not at the NARA because they're not kept at the federal level. But even though these are where the original records are kept, some of them might be online. So let's look at some websites that can help you find some of these original records. If you can't find them online, note that the NARA is constantly digitizing and adding new things, but you might have to order it. So first is Fold3. This is one of the most popular websites to get military records. It is a subscription website, but you can get it for free at the Family Search Library or Family Search Center. And we have the Family Search Library at Salt Lake City, Utah, but we have thousands of centers around the world. It's going to focus on many military records. And here's just an example of some examples of some records that you might find. This page can be sometimes confusing to use, but I would recommend that you narrow down to the exact war that you want to go for. So from the home page, just scroll down a little bit, find what war your ancestor might have served in and click on it, and then you can start seeing what collections are under that war. Ancestry is another great website. It is subscription-based, but it has a lot of collections for military. And again, you can use a free version of Ancestry at the Family Search Library or centers. Next, we have Family Search. This has a lot of records for military, including a lot of indexes for pension records and service records. So I would recommend if you're planning a trip to go to the Family Search Library or for one of the centers that you want to use either Fold3 or Ancestry, but you just don't have a subscription for, you could use these Family Search indexes, figure out which files you want to do and get organized, and then come visit the library or a center, and then you can use those subscriptions for free and do all of them at once. National Archives has also, as I mentioned, digitizing and putting their images on their catalog, and the Family Search Wiki has a lot of the links to these collections. And so if you can't find the digital images, you might want to wait to see if it's ever digitized, or you can actually order them through this page, and I have linked it into your handout. So there's a lot of other places that you can look for. American Ancestors is very beneficial for War of 1812. Recommend checking out local genealogy and historical societies because they sometimes have really unique documents. You want to look for online books like rosters or unit histories or county histories. And the Family Search Library has a lot of these books. And we're slowly digitizing our books so they will become more accessible. And there's a lot of other websites out there. So use compiled lists like Cindy's List or Google to find some of those more unique websites. I do want to mention there is a little bit of record loss with military records. In November 1800, the War Department building in Washington, D.C. was burned, and the fire did destroy most of the Revolutionary War records, including those early pensions. But there are a lot of records created after 1800 for the Revolutionary War, so you might still be able to find some information about your ancestors. But like with anything in genealogy, make note of any record loss, because that could explain why you can't find something. So with the time remaining, we're going to go through the case study and just kind of summarize everything that we learned so far. Like with any research, you want to start with what do you know. So I know I wanted to research about Ebenezer Chandler. He was born about 1790 in Vermont, and he was married to Lucinda. They had many, many children, and one I knew of was Lucy Mann, 1823. And then I know Ebenezer died in 1873 in Iowa. So with this known information, I would go to other records to help verify what I know, and also see if there's any clues from those records that help me know about a service. I won't show everything that I did, but I will show you how I did some. But I recommend create tables, create charts, keep track of everything that you know. You never know what little clue in one little record might be the key to breaking a brick wall and help you later find some records that you're looking for. So here is an example of clues I gathered from census records. A fundamental part of U.S. research is census records. So if you're not using census records, even those pre-1850 census records, you are not doing research properly in the United States. Make sure you're not missing out on them. I created this table to figure out when Ebenezer likely lived throughout his life, as well as maybe when he was born. And obviously those pre-1851 is only going to give me about a range of his birth, but a range is better than nothing. And it's also important to note that Ebenezer was living with his children in the 1860 and 70 censuses, so it's likely that he was a widow at that point. So I began to search for an index card to determine if maybe Ebenezer served. I figured out based on his age, he probably served in the War of 1812. So I went to a Family Search historical collection record, and under the collection title, I typed in War of 1812, and I was able to find this collection. On it, I typed in Ebenezer's name, and I was able to find this index card. Obviously, just because the name matches doesn't mean it's him. So let's take a look at it. In this top portion, we can see some numbers that reveal his service, as well as enlistment and dischargement date, and then also some numbers about the bounty land. In the bottom portion of this index, it has some genealogical information to see if we know if this is him. So it gives us some of his residences in 1850, 55, and 71, which we could compare to the census records, and those are matching with where we know he was. He was in Henry County, those censuses, so that matches. Tells us the maiden name of his wife. We know his wife was Lucinda, but here we discovered what her maiden name was. It also tells us the date and place that he was married, which when I did my research to determine as much as I could about Ebenezer, I discovered their first child was born in 1817. So since their marriage was 1 year prior, that's pretty consistent with trends. So I could figure out this is probably him. And then I can also see when his wife died in 1853. So my theory that Ebenezer was a widow by the 1860 census does match this document. So see, when you just gather all of those clues together and compare it to what you know, I could determine, based on this index card, this is the Ebenezer we're looking for. But how do we find his pension and bounty land? Well, if I go back to the historical records page for the collection that I found my index card, under the title, we have a how to use this collection, and this will take you to a wiki article that tells you a little bit more about this particular collection and also where you can get the original files. And in the related National Archives collection, I think it was under the second collection, the War of 1812 Pension and Bounty Land Warrant applications. It took me to this National Archives catalog page, and part of it is digitized. And fortunately, I was able to find Ebenezer Chandler and be creative with searching. The searching isn't great. I searched for Ebenezer Chandler and I couldn't find him. But when I searched for Chandler in New York, I was able to find him. So be creative with how you're searching in this catalog. But on it, it gave me the pension index card, which is matching what I got from Family Search. And then it has all 39 pages of his pension. So that is excellent. But let's say if the National Archive, even though it's partially digitized, let's say if I couldn't find him, you could then go to fold 3 and see if he's there. I searched for Ebenezer Chandler, New York, and I was specifically looking for War of 1812 pension files. And the first one is him. And as you can see, here is the same pension index card. So let's take a look. I know we only have a few more minutes left of the class, but I'll just quickly go through some of the things I found about Ebenezer. So again, we have his name and his rank is private, and it tells us which company he is in and which regiment in New York. So for this one, it gives us about some of the application for bounty land. This top portion tells us under the Act of 1855 that he received 120 acres. If you remember, the Act of 1855, they can receive up to 160 acres, so that makes me think he already received 40 acres. Well, that's the case, because when I kept looking through his file, I found that in 1850 he received 40 acres. So there we go, there's our history. It's matching up with what this record says, so it's important to know the history so you know what the record's telling you. And what's great is here's this pension file, but it's also telling us about the bounty that he received. So then this document is a brief claim for survivor's pension, and it tells us about when Ebenezer was enlisted, discharged, and when he declared and how long he served. And below that, it tells us about his loyalty to the United States and those that he was witnessing. And it's important to note all of the names of those witnesses because one of the witnesses is Thomas Mann. We know his daughter was Lucy Mann, so we can infer that this is likely maybe her husband, but you would want to do more research to determine if that's him. And then we could figure out if George Joseph Short is a friend or a relative. There are many letters in Ebenezer's files explaining why he should qualify for pension. For this particular letter, it says that he'd never received a pension before, and even though he did receive bounty land previously, that's not, even though it's similar to pensions, it's not the same. So he did receive bounty land, but now he's saying, I've never received a pension, which is true, so he wants it. Here is the information we get about his marriage, as well as when his wife died. And it also says he never remarried, so that's a great clue to learn. This next file tells us more about his service. It tells us that he was of Captain John Bassett's company, but later was commanded by Colonel Henry Bloom. And it tells us when he was drafted and that he served for 3 months. And it tells us where he was honorably discharged. And it's important to say he was honorably discharged, so he could receive that pension. Next, we find more about this Ebenezer when it's dated, and it tells us he was 62 years age, so it tells us about when he was born. And then it gives us more about how he received his bounty of 40 acres, and it gives us some more witnesses. One is a Chandler, so it could be a potential relative. And then I could see the declaration for his pension. And next we have a letter. This one's interesting because it says that the original application didn't have the correct wording from his witnesses, but since one of the witnesses was traveling to Europe, he can't amend that testimony, so they need to find another witness. And so I think that's so great to kind of get that information, and it adds more witnesses to this file, which is great for our fan club research. And then this next document is an affidavit, which again has our witnesses on it and says how long they've known him for and says that he was a loyal citizen during the Civil War. And then finally, we have some more information about the War of 1812. And one thing that I thought was interesting, let me go back, is it says that he was on the list for John Bassett's company, but he was never on the other company. So you could see there's some conflicting information. He later said he was part of two companies, but we see here he's only part of one. And then finally, we have a letter that says that they found the application sufficient, and so he will receive his pension. And then finally, we have another letter just confirming all of the information is correct. So that's a lot of information from pension files, but I created a timeline just to get an idea of what happened with his drafting, enlistment, his discharge, when he was married, when he received the Bounty Act, how much land he received, and when he declared for pension. And then finally, we determined he did grant his pension and he received $8 a month. So that was a lot to cover. So I went a little over time, but hopefully you know a little bit more about the history and background of military records for these early wars in the United States history. We identified those 4 key record types, determine if your ancestor was part of the service, where to find those military records, and then finally just showed you a brief case study of all that we learned about Ebenezer, who served during the War of 1812.